And we'll start recording. Okay. Hi, everyone. Good to see all of you. Some new faces, some old friends. My name is Justine Johnson. I'm the Associate Director at Kirkridge Retreat and Study Center. And as many of you know, for the fall, summer into fall, we switched to virtual programs. So we are still building community, staying connected, and providing sacred space. It's a gift today. I'm trying to think of another word, but I think it's so true to have Delicia join us. Delicia and I have known each other for 6 years, which doesn't seem that long, but truly in both of our young professions, that's quite a bit of time to be able to commit to friendship, professional networks, and stay really in support. I'm also grateful because Delicia lives maybe about 25 minutes away from Kirkridge in the Poconos, which was just a beautiful happenstance when I moved back to the United States to take this position. She was there, ready to catch me when I came back. So I'll talk a little bit more about how Delicia and I's work and friendship have interweaved. But I'll say right now, this is also really exciting for me to talk about on Labor Day. What a perfect day to talk about social justice, labor rights, care, unpaid value, valued work, undervalued work, and also how we care for ourselves, communities, and the systems. So I've invited Delicia into this conversation. And then maybe, Delicia, after you introduce yourselves, I think we have time with this small group to have everyone introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well and sharing this space with us. Like Justine said, we've known each other for quite some time. We worked at the University of Scranton together and have grown in our friendship and professional support. And it was exciting to have her back on the East Coast in the Poconos. I was also returning from an abroad experience in Brazil where I was doing a Fulbright grant. So it was nice to have both of our parallel lives. She was coming back from Vietnam and time in Asia, and I was in Brazil and South America, and connecting on those two lived experiences. And a little background about me, I went to Fairfield University in Connecticut, studied psychology and Spanish with a minor in educational studies, and have worked as a Spanish teacher, higher education professional. And when I came back from Brazil, I was really deciding what was next step. And I stumbled upon online entrepreneurship and kind of transitioned to teach online and work online and provide services in interview prep, career coaching in the online space with students. And so I'm CEO of Delicia Academy, which is the work that I do day to day, and also love supporting Justine and her retreat centers efforts and workshops and connecting with all different peoples from the US and abroad. My family is from Paraguay, South America, so first generation student and individual in the US. I grew up in New Jersey, so I'm really a Jersey girl at heart. Transplant in the Poconos right now. So that's a little bit about me, and I love all things diversity and inclusion, social work, social justice work, and connecting with students and having all of these conversations.
This is so exciting, mostly because I think it's just going to be a grand conversation. I'll try and stop saying this is so exciting. But as we open up the space to, if you'll unmute your audio if it's muted, I would love to hear you say your name, anything else, mind it being brief, and then one word you think of when we say self-care. One word or one phrase, because I feel like, Sally, you might have a phrase. But I just invite, there's enough of us, it's okay if we talk over each other as we introduce, because that just means you can go after the one person's done speaking.
I like the word authentic.
All right, and what's your name, Jack?
It's Jack Kennevin. I'm sorry, I go by Jack, and my lovely wife's name is up there. But I'll try to address that next time.
No problem. Thanks, Jack.
My word is balance.
Balance.
Great. That was Arlene.
I'm Judy Ruff, and my word would be outdoors.
Thanks, Judy.
I'm Sally, and Justine knows me well. My phrase is women's ways of knowing.
Thanks, Sally.
I'll go because mine is a little related to that. My name is Mariam, and my phrase is trying to do what I know.
Mm.
Emphasis on the trying.
Great, thank you, Miriam. And good to see you again.
You too.
I'm Barbara, and I think I would say finding the good.
Great, Barbara. Just give it one more second if there's another person who wants to add another word or introduce themselves. Delicia.
I don't mean any offense, but working down at the jail, when one of the people I'm talking with your counseling will say, well, I'll try. And I'll say, time out. Do, don't do, but don't try. Be decisive. So we could make a fortune if we pattern, the Ridge wanted to do a t-shirt. Do, don't do, just decide.
Thanks, Jack. That's a really interesting concept. And I almost want to say, I will commit to trying. That's my decisiveness, is the commit to try. And we're definitely going to talk about what does the trying look like? And Jack, I think you're right. What's the doing? What is the doing of this related to self-care and social justice? Delicia, I'm going to put you on the spot. Did you have a word?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. I think my word is take the first step, or phrase, take the first step.
Love that. I have lots of words about self-care, and I think it's love. Love for yourself and love for your community. And that's really where this conversation stems from, is being in community with people. How do we care for ourselves as a role modeling to care for others and in service to others, especially connected to social justice? That's where we'll start our conversation. But before we do that, as Delicia referenced, Delicia and I started these conversations when we were both working at the University of Scranton, in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is a Catholic Jesuit university. And if anybody's been to Scranton, you get 10 points. It's a beautiful place, but also where one truly needs to practice self-care, resiliency, understanding, and being committed to a community. Well, we tried to create these spaces in the offices we worked in, which were the Multicultural Center and Women's Center, really providing space for students to become self-reliant, invested in themselves and their community, and really rooted in what does self-love look for individual students. And I'm saying this and quite easily, but it was a long journey. We often worked with people who had experienced sexual violence, hate crimes, other traumatic experiences, and those who didn't feel like they belonged at a university. That might have been because of access and equity. Generally, it was about access and equity, but really we wanted to make sure they felt cared for and that they would leave the University of Scranton having the tools in their toolkit to care for themselves. Is there anything you want to add to that, Delicia?
I think it was a lot of processing Justine and I did a lot of processing with students to put their voice at the center of the narrative and of the conversation so they can feel empowered to make a decision as to what the self-care looked like for them, or self-love for them, or advocacy for themselves. Because activism is part of self-care and self-worth, because you're actively either yourself or asking someone to support you in asking for what you need. Part of self-care is asking for what you need, even if it's asking of yourself for that time and space, or asking someone else at an institution to create that space for you. So I think that was a lot of the work we did as facilitators of those departments, is the students as the center of the narrative and the conversation.
Thanks, Delicia. So you're already starting to hear both of us talk about self-care in a way that doesn't necessarily fit the mainstream narrative of bubble baths, spa days, Starbucks lattes, which are all awesome. I'm not going to lie, I indulge in some of those things. We're talking about a commitment to work in centering people's lives, being able to be vulnerable, have conversations, and engage in what will make a person thrive. We're also talking about it as a pattern and a habit, which I know Delicia will talk more about in a little bit. And maybe that's where we can start, is defining what self-care is. I think both of us are not going to give you a dictionary term, but what I know some components of self-care is that it's necessary for the individual, the community, the environment. Care is incredibly important and often overlooked. As I said, it's also a pattern of something you want to integrate into a habit or ritual around your life, but it's always easier said than done. Sometimes self-care can look pretty gritty or messy. Unless you're thinking about a spa, then that sounds beautiful and expensive. So it's also activities that align with your values. If one of your values is trying to lower your consumerism, buying a latte isn't that, but maybe it's carving out time to be in the outdoors, which is such a great one-word phrase for self-care that's unique to the person. It's also not one moment and not necessarily expensive, which I think is the main kind of push against the mainstream understanding of self-care. Delicia, do you have any kind of core takeaways for self-care?
I think the core takeaway is it starts with knowing yourself, or know thyself, because we in many ways are conditioned through our family, through society, through the books we read, through the education system that we go through, no matter where we are in the States or the world. And a lot of the things that we consume and internalize are really not our own. So I think at the core of self-care is understanding who I am as a person, as an individual, and then how does that relate to the community care, right? Because if I care for myself, then that trickles into the community and the spaces and the people that I connect with. So I always, like I said before, the center of the narrative with students is who they are, what do they need, and how do we support them? And in our day-to-day lives, who we are, what do we need, and how do we accept that as is, and then create a boundary around that and provide that care and that support. And if that's going outdoors and walking and exercise, or what does that look like, we'll continue to talk about in this conversation. But I think at the core and the first step is really learning who we are, and then if that means unlearning what maybe society or schooling or parenting has told us who we are, if that makes sense.
I'd like a latte right now instead of doing that, right? Like that's deep work to unlearn. So no wonder this like mainstream narrative of self-care is purchasing things, kind of filling this void, because it can be deep work to know yourself and then know what your needs are. And then I feel like that third step is voicing them. So I think because we have this small group, you're welcome to ask questions along the way instead of Delicia and I just going back and forth. Please do that in the chat, or also you can raise your hand or just speak into this space. But I think Delicia also has this beautiful understanding of self-care and how it intersects with liberation and community care. So I also invite her to just roll because she is wise.
I think what Justine talked about, I love lattes. I love a good spa. Don't get me wrong. I think those are great things that kind of soothe our bodies, soothe our soul, soothe ourselves. And then underneath that soothing, underneath that layer, there is deep reckoning that has to happen as we grow into who we are meant to be and our purpose in this world, right? And one of the biggest things attached to liberation is your worth does not equal productivity, right? I'm not sure where you all are in your journey with social justice work or liberation theory or all of that. So I'm going to throw things at you. And if you have questions, feel free to ask me, or if something doesn't resonate, like I would love an open dialogue about it. And I say your worth does not equal productivity because we grow up in a system that X dollars or X hours equals X amount of income. And if you want more of that, you have to work more and grind and hustle to get to that end result. And we're on this hamster wheel, a never ending hamster wheel. And there comes a point where either our physical body or our mental health just ruptures, and we have to reckon with what is going on, because under this capitalist patriarchal system, we are taught to do that when that doesn't really align with our bodies and our minds and how we operate as human beings, right? Who says 9 to 5 is the norm? Who taught us that, right? Why do we have to wake up at X time to do something when our body's not ready to wake up, right? Should we listen to our body, right? And our society and our system doesn't allow in many ways to do that deep reckoning. And that's all part of worth and productivity and self-care, and they're all intertwined, right? So that's kind of the first step, is reflecting on who we are, why do we value certain things, who taught us to value certain things, and why, I think are the connecting questions that I personally always go back to. And Justine and I always talked about how yoga has become commodified and all these self-care spas that are popping up. And of course it's important, but it's also what is behind that consumerist capitalist marketing tactic that it happens, is like, do we want to consume more of that? Does that actually help? I don't know. We have to reckon with that question. And obviously retreat centers, at the core of the retreat center is for the spiritual awakening and the spiritual growth. And how do we balance that? I think are important conversations to have.
So I think, Delicia, in your first sentence is a good place to start, and then we'll kind of unpack. One thing I heard is self-soothe and self-care, and that self-soothing can be a part of self-care, but self-soothing is kind of those one-stop shops, right? Like that one hit, rather than this integrated plan. So self-soothing is lattes, which we both love, and that's usually how we spent our breaks. But it's also, how do you integrate that into a larger plan that you habitualize? And so self-soothing techniques could be more kind of like these breaks or respite or escapes from your everyday, but self-care really is about living the life that you want, that is true to you and your values. Does that distinction make sense? Because often I think in many narratives, they're one and the same.
Yeah.
Okay. Questions?
Thoughts?
Jack, I think your audio is on mute.
A thought occurred to me. This is why I like community, be it in church or in small group. Just listening everybody's word. I like the one, I think it was Sally, who said women's ways of knowing. And my God, you could write a book on that, because it's a mystery to me, you know. But I tease, but just to have such journeying, your lives are so precious, and what you share in these groups. I never fully understood shadow work until I came with this group. I mean, I heard it was a phrase, but this group has helped to delve into what's holding me back. And I like that word. How do I soothe myself in these moments?
That's great, Jack. Thank you. I think we could all write books of our own lived experiences too, right? Like every woman, gender fluid person, man, trans person has a way of knowing. And then there's some that are unvalued or undervalued. And I think that links to Sally's question in the chat. I'm not sure if everyone saw it, but do you have any sense of the intersection of self-care with age, gender, race? And I'm sure that the list of identities could go on.
I think I love intersectionality. And Justine and I always talk about Kimberly Crenshaw's work with intersectionality and how we all have those different layers and levels, and they're all fluid, and they all are, some are more salient than others when we engage in certain activities in the world. And the first thing that came to my mind when I read that question or that comment is the identity of women and womanhood. And I identify as a Latina woman, right? My family comes from South America. So those generational, intergenerational livings of coming from another land and traveling and moving and transnational movement, how does that carry in my psyche and understanding of the world and self-care and this identity marker of being a strong, resilient woman, right? So that's a role and an identity that we are identified with, and then understanding, but sometimes I don't want to be strong and resilient. I want to self-soothe and I want to cry and I want to just exist, right? So how do we reckon with both of those identities of there's a time and place for strongness and resiliency, but there's also a time to be vulnerable and be and just exist as I come, right? Which is why I love what Sally said, women's way of knowing. And that's part of understanding who I am or who you are as an individual. And when you're up against that knowing and that boundary, it's like, oh, maybe I need to slow down or I need to take a step back and understand that. And that comes from knowing who I am. Or the trope of a strong Black woman, right? Sometimes they don't want to be strong, right? They need to heal. They need to just take a step back. But because history and society has pushed them in this role, sometimes until that ruptures is when they can take a step back. So I don't know if you've all felt a certain identity or a certain intersections of your identity where you have had to kind of come to terms with, right? Or a man, right? Do they have to be the strong breadwinner of the family? Society has taught us that the man has to be the breadwinner. Is that something that has to rupture before we can say, maybe I can be a soft father, I can be this, or I don't know. I don't know all your lived experiences. So living from my own experience, that's what I thought of when I read Sally's question.
I think there's an asterisk to that too, of redefinitions of strength and care and who gets to be what. Like all of this is kind of the story we tell, and how do we as individuals and those who represent systems and organizations shift that to say self-care is about strength. And Delicia, you and I would talk to students about that often, of resilience is sometimes knowing your limits. That's it. For me, that was such a major takeaway working with survivors who've experienced sexual violence. I'm going to shift from that, which was a weird note, wanted to make. Another thing I think about when I read Sally's question was, often when I talk about self-care, I encourage people to seek therapy. Whether your life is wonderful or not, or you've had one trauma experience or a whole slew. And seeking therapy is also gendered and racialized. Many marginalized communities do not feel comfortable seeking therapy and don't often see a therapist or counselor who looks like them or represents identities they hold. So even in strategies, some might work for me, and many that work for me might not work for others. And I think, Delicia, I'm just going to like segue to you. That's one thing, is about finding a self-care plan that works for you. So if I say, well, I bake bread, which would be a strategy I would share with all of you. I love it. I love baking. I shared with Delicia, this is mine, that it's pretty affordable. One, because I have an oven. Some do not. So this already makes self-care strategy out the window. Flour, water, and yeast are pretty affordable. And I love the idea of nourishing myself and nourishing others, giving bread as a gift. You all might want to be like, oh, hate the kitchen, not going in it. Well, if that's stressful, that's not a good self-care strategy for you. So what would work for individuals or collectives, finding communities that have the same kind of self-care strategies you have would be another kind of interlinking between, in, intra, age, race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ability. Delicia, do you want to talk a little bit about finding your own self-care plan?
Absolutely. So like I said, our first step, right, know thyself is, okay, now that I know that, what does that look like with techniques, and what can work for me might not work for Justine or for anyone else on this call. So for me, that journey is really having conversations with me. When I was younger, I used to dance and play soccer, and those were moments of deep joy and fun. So how do I learn to incorporate that as an adult? And realizing that as an adult, you can experience joy and fun and continue to dance. Is it alone in my room? Is it joining a dance studio as an adult? Or is it joining a soccer team that plays on the weekends? What does that look like? I know now with COVID and all of the things happening in the world, it looks a lot different. So that brings me to my point of understanding that this is not a linear path. This is a, I don't know, cyclical or ebb and flow, however you want to understand that. But it's not from point A to B, C, D, E. It's like, oh, let me do A to B. B might go back to A and then go to D, and jump around and figure out where you are in the season of your life. So with COVID and what's going on, it's a new season in all of our lives. So we're all learning and readjusting to what does self-care look like now. And right now it's different than what it looked like when I lived in Brazil or lived in South Carolina or in Connecticut. So it adjusts to where we are. And right now it looks like more journaling, right? We're more inside. And like I said, I live in the Poconos, so there are a lot of trees and trails in my community. So I can go for a walk and just sit in nature and connect to Mother Earth and the soil and grass. Does that work for me? Or are there too many bugs and I'm distracted by the bugs? I don't know. I have to figure that out too. Is it sitting down and meditating for 30 minutes? Or an hour? I think in the beginning, I really wanted to sit for 30 minutes and listen to Deepak Chopra soothe me, and then realize I don't like his meditations. They don't resonate with me. So who do I find that connects with me? There are so many other people online on YouTube to look for meditations until I find some that I really like and that are soothing and that connect to how I want to engage with self-care, right? It stops my mind from racing. It really tells me to slow down. So to kind of put it in ABC terms, now in this season of my life, it's journaling. So it's not a Dear Diary type of technique. It's a technique I can share with you later if you want to learn more about that. But I pick a quote from Cheryl Strayed's book, Brave Enough, which is right here. I keep it handy when I need inspiration and I just flip through it. I pick a quote, I journal on it. I do that however many times a day I need it. And then I have found some meditations I like, depending on the day I listen or don't listen. I try to go on more walks depending on the weather in the Poconos. And I read a lot. As you can tell from behind me, I have a lot of books. So I really like to read, which helps with self-care as feeding knowledge and curiosity. So those are kind of techniques that work for me. Baking bread might be fun, but also stressful. So that might not be the first thing I choose to do. But in the past, I've joined soccer teams. I've done dance studios. So those are kind of techniques that have worked for me. And I think the key takeaway is really understanding who you are, where you are in your life, and what you might need in that particular moment.
I think that changes too with Sally's question about age. I think my needs are very different now than when I was 20 and 30 and 40. And so, like you're saying, to to experiment to see what works now. And sometimes it helps to have friends who see you stressing out and reminding you that you need to care for yourself. And that happened to me very early on when a colleague said, Arlene, you're browning out, you're scorching, and you need a break. And I began to notice that I need a break about every 8 weeks. I've got to get away someplace. And I can't right now. And that's driving me crazy. So I walk, and I also do Road Scholar virtual trips. And so being substitutes for things that I used to do, that in this time, that's very helpful. But keeping that balance between work and play, my spiritual life, that's why I use that word balance, because that balance shifts as time, depending upon your circumstances, your age. Yeah, that's been me.
Thanks, Arlene. I think that's wonderful. I think you're right. Both Delicia and I might be out of it. I might be like mid-career at this point. But as young professionals, we were like, there is no balance. It is work, and we have to prove ourselves and be productive and stretch ourselves. And as young women in this field in higher education, is also say like, yes, I can do it, and I'll do it better. And that was just like so incredibly depleting. And so I value your words, and also hear a strategy in there, which is also finding a community that will help you manage self-care. And I think you also talked about why self-care is so important. And for us, so important for social justice is to prevent burnout. Really having a plan in place before you're already exhausted, depleted, burned out. And it helps you build resilience. So hopefully burning out never happens. When we think of activists and advocates, burnout is like wildly high because it's giving all you have all the time. So what about giving all you have? And some of that is giving it back to yourself. And I think that really loops into Sally's comment in the chat, which is, in our culture, I find self-care to be an oxymoron. We are taught that care means what you do for others. And so ahead of this, I had pulled some quotes, Sally, that I needed to hear, because self-care felt selfish right away. And I had used the cliche phrase, but it didn't quite fit, like you can't pour from an empty cup, right? Give to yourself what you give to your community. But I also love this quote from Audre Lorde: caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. I'll just read it again, and then I think maybe we all, or Delicia, can help lead us in a conversation about rest and joy as resistance. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. How does that land on people?
Justine, would you repeat? You said self-care is not self-indulgence, it is?
Self-preservation.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'll send it in the chat too while we sit with that for a minute.
I love Audre Lorde. I wish she had taken it into warfare, because for me, part of self-care is even staying away from some of that kind of language. But I understand, what she's saying. And I think for me, as I'm listening to this whole conversation, I'm taken back to my own work now, which is reconnecting, remembering that I am nature. I'm reconnecting with the land, reconnecting with my own seasons and my inner and outer seasons. And nature is my greatest teacher about self-care.
Thanks, Sally.
Well, you know, I think self-care is also, it's revolutionary because it's countercultural. It's not the way the world teaches us. So we have to be we have to be countercultural. And as Jesus was, I mean, I think he's a great model for me of being countercultural, standing up for what he believed, which was against the values of his world around him, and taking care of himself by going off to the mountain to be alone and to recharge. He took care of himself as well as others. He's a good model.
Mm-hmm.
Giving space for comments on Audre Lorde's. I pulled the same quote too for the conversation.
Yeah.
I think what stands out the most to me in that quote is just the idea of self-preservation as an act of resistance in a world that wants to prescribe what we can be. And even if you are like the mainstreamest of mainstream celebrated identities, I mean, there's a thing to be said about privilege and oppression, but there's also something to be said for me about just like the prescriptiveness that society has really clear roles that they want all of us to fill. And some are funner than others, but all can be a prison if they're not real, if they're not true to you. And so I think, and Delicia, earlier you said something about the word reckoning. Self-care for me, above all, is like a spiritual practice. Like, and that means it's about an attitude. So if I'm going to a spa day and I'm just like, oh, I'm just gonna like flop like a blob in these people's hands and just, that's self-soothing and I love it. But what would take it into self-care for me is a mindset of like, my body's exhausted and it needs care, and how wonderful that I can afford that, and that these, you know, like there's something about honoring what I really need and who I really am. I guess I'm repeating some of the things you guys have said, but it's resonating for me.
And thank you. And I love hearing it in your voice. So thank you for sharing. And I think it's rooted in that listening to your mind, body, and soul. Mm-hmm.
I always tell the people at the jail I'm working with, when they get out, have a plan that's doable and realistic and inclusive. Planning is so important for effective and satisfying living. I liked, it was, I wrote her name down, Arlene, who said Rhodes Scholar, virtual what?
Virtual
Arlene?
lectures.
Again?
Virtual lectures.
Okay, thank you.
Virtual. Also, Viking River cruises do the same thing too. Take you all over the world.
I know.
It doesn't cost anything either.
I like that. Thank you.
No, it's not RHODE. It's ROAD. You're on the road.
Oh, thank you.
ROAD. Used to be.
I also thought RHODE. Yeah.
So did I.
That's very clever naming. They're good marketers.
Yeah.
Well done.
It used to be Elder Hostel.
Right.
Oh.
They named it over, and that's exactly. But they take you at age 55, and sometimes younger.
So I think before we share strategies, if you feel comfortable of what has worked for you or something you would like to try, right? This is a practice. And as Delicia said, this ebbing and flowing, like what's going to work and what's not. For me, it's been trial and error where I'm, okay, this is definitely, I see 100,000 viewers on Instagram doing this. It's got to be for me. And it's not. And that's okay, right? Like, what is for me? in this world that isn't kind of sliced out nicely for everyone, that's quite cookie cutter and benefits certain privilege or certain identities and privileges others over other people. So what works? I would love to engage in that, but first let's talk about self-care as joy and rest, and what that means for resistance, for social justice. I think that'll be kind of like a nice way to close out the time before we start strategies. Delicia, do you have anything you want to offer before I speak?
There were two things that came up with what Miriam said. I hope I said your name right. Number one is I'm honoring my mind, body, and spirit because I'm worth this self-soothing technique or this self-care 30-minute practice that I should incorporate daily because I am worth that amount. And in the same way that I would offer 30 minutes to a student or an individual to create space for their reckoning and their self-care, I can create it for myself, and that we are worthy of that. And then another thing that came up with Rest as Resistance and Audre Lorde's quote that we pulled is, the colonial patriarchal system has us programmed that we are in servitude to that system, right? So taking away rest as resistance is a direct connection to disrupting that colonial patriarchal system, right? I'm gonna take it macro sociological for hot sec, academic at heart, right? We all operate under this colonial system, right? All the isms stem from colonialism. So we are doing 500 plus years of decolonialism work. So of course we're tired. Of course we have all this weight on our shoulders because we are doing intergenerational decolonial deprogramming work. So the spa is at the surface level, giving us permission to engage that we are worthy in that and to receive that, because it's a cyclical thing of giving and receiving, but we're also deprogramming all this other gunk that we have inherited from the colonial past, right? So I think we also have to give ourselves grace in that, right? When we bring it to a macro level like that, it's like, oh yeah, of course I'm freaking tired. It's like 500 plus years of this programming that we have to tease away at, deconstruct, unearth, and unprogram or deprogram, whatever the vernacular is, right? If that makes sense. I think it's always important to keep ourselves in that context and that framework, is that yes, we're in the year 2020. However, we have so many years of programming that we have to deprogram, kind of like reset and reboot ourselves every once in a while. Like our computer, right? After a couple hours, it's like, I need to rest. I need a software update, right? So do we. We need a software update. So those were kind of the two things. I'm worthy of that, but also understanding that we are programmed in this colonial patriarchal society and world, and how do we decolonialize and deprogram our mind from that? And which is what I love what Miriam said, is like our mindset shift. We have to rewire our brain, right? Psych major, so I love the brain. So we have to rewire what's happening in our minds to then manifest into the world of a tangible experience. If that makes sense. I know I use a lot of big words, so if you have questions, let me know.
You know, for me, I remember years ago, I heard a Dutch theologian, Henricus Burkhoff, who asked us the question, whatever happened to all those 1960 demonstrators and, you know, social justice people? They all kind of petered out. And I said, you need to be tapped into the power source in order to continue to do your social justice work. And I think when we take care of ourselves, we are giving our bodies rest so we can receive the power to do the work that needs to be done. And unless we care for ourselves, we're not going to have the strength or the courage or the power. So that's an important component of, that's again, part of the balance that we need to maintain in order to have what we need to move forward.
I think that this could be another hour long at minimum, about, especially with those last two thoughts, thinking about power and knowing it's not finite, even though, again, mainstream culture says it is, but also reshifting to being empowering and empowered, and then finding that community that helps power you up or make you feel empowered, and vice versa, empowering a community to act. I often think about how this is kind of mapped out or linked in that, and how self-care is linked to community care in that, and unlearning. There was another quote that we didn't pick, but that self-care and self-love is revolutionary because it is counterculture. It is not looking at Facebook or buying a magazine and feeling bad about yourself. It is saying, I am worthy and I am loved and I love myself. I think is, having these mantras about self-care is also important, and it changes the culture, changes how we tell our story to ourselves and to our community, and to maybe people we don't know are in our community yet. What are the stories we're talking about when we talk about self-care and community care and social justice? Okay, let's just have 6 more hours. That's all I ask of you. That's it for this conversation. But unfortunately, we only have 9 minutes. So someday we will meet again, hopefully soon. But as we kind of close out this event, what are some self-care strategies, tools in your toolkit, things you would like to share about self-care, community care, and social justice? I think Delicia and I will leave the floor open for a bit, and we'd love to hear your voices.
This is sort of a plug for something coming up, but I'd like to say that one of my great teachers in self-care is doing a mini retreat on Zoom for Kirkridge on October the 7th from 5 to 6:30. That's Marion David. So I just want to, if you want more, I highly recommend that you join us on October 7th.
Thanks, Sally, on sustaining the soul.
Yes, yes.
One of the things I've done for years is journaling, and I find it really helpful. I went back through some of my old journals just recently because I thought perhaps I shouldn't just keep them around forever. But it was just interesting to see how life has changed, and you get insights from the writing that you just don't get other ways. I do anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm going to talk for a second. Early on in this pandemic, we're retired and we live in Texas when we're not in Minnesota. We came back to Minnesota, which seemed like a better place to spend the pandemic. It looks like we may have to make a decision about this winter.
You didn't count on the winter.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but early on, I just decided we need to have some structure and routine in our lives to kind of take care of ourselves, and so just self-care, real basic self-care, like, getting up, eating healthy, getting exercise, and stuff like that. We're retired, so I don't have to try and structure it around a job or children, and stuff like that. But then also kind of finding community and being connected to people in ways like this, and like a couple other Zoom opportunities I have. But that just seems like it's just basic self-care, and to me it doesn't feel very revolutionary at all. It just means this is how we're going to get through this, and this is the best thing for us, and it seems to be working. I'm not depressed. I'm not feeling bad about things. Also kind of sheltering from the outside world, not just the, sheltering from the news and stuff like that. That's been important. Kind of.
Thanks, Judy. Good to hear you and share your strategies.
Excuse me. One value that I find in taking time throughout the day to assess my relationships. As I get older, it's too easy to be self-centered. I know self-care is important, but I need people. I may be bypassing them, ignorant of my behavior, etc. But I remember in the Christian Brothers, we always started class with, let us remember we're in the holy presence of God. And then we'd say a prayer and then get to work. And I find that practice frequently just during the day. Kind of reconnoiter, stepping back, like retreating, to gather together and bring my resources together for a purpose. And I apologize for being so long-winded.
Thank you for sharing, Jack.
I do two things. I walk pretty fast, 2 miles a day.
Whoa.
And and uphill, some of it, to keep me in good shape. And then I'm part of a centering prayer group once a week. And we're going to meet for the first time on Zoom. We've been meeting alone in our homes, knowing we're together, but not together. And now we're going to do Zoom this week. Woo!
Thanks, Arlene.
Well, I'll follow that because one of the best, in the strangest way, the pandemic has been really good for my self-care. I am in a time of my life where I am working and I'm working multiple jobs and hustling hard. And I'm not early in my career, but I still got a long road ahead, God willing. So I'm working really hard, and I'm always meaning to do self-care when we were not in this time, but this has given me a lot of time to figure out how to do some of that. So one thing that I've been doing that's really precious to me is just doing a lot more spiritual practices. And I know I keep saying that phrase, but I mean formally right now, like the other retreat center that has my heart other than Kirkridge is Pendle Hill. And they have twins. They have morning meeting, a Quaker meeting every morning. And my partner and I have been doing that together. And we actually have different faiths. So it has been so amazing to shared spiritual practice and start our day like that every day. It's been a tremendous blessing and richness in our life to start to have some shared vernacular for the spiritual. And I also do centering prayer by Zoom, Arlene, here in New York. So I can vouch that it works on Zoom.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Yeah. And biking. I started biking.
Thank you so much. And for all of you, the plethora of different strategies that work for you. And a lot of them touched on community, having a community to do this with, or at least one other person, your physical body, but also your mental capacities, that it isn't just about eating. I don't even know how many calories a person is supposed to get a day, but that, only that amount. Clearly I get more, or don't know, or exercising, running 10 miles a day, right? It isn't just about these achievement goals, but what feels good for your body, what feels good for your mind, what feels good for your soul. And hopefully that all comes together in your self-care plan. So it was interesting to hear. And now I have 8 more things that I'd like to follow up on and learn more about. And many of you, as we close out, spoke to self-care strategies that work for me. And one of them is getting enough water in my day. Just reminding myself to drink water instead of coffee, which is more difficult in COVID for me, honestly. I'm near my kitchen now. I'm I'd love a second pot. And then reading, as Delicia said. So I wanted to leave you with some resources, and I'll email them to you as well. But I just wanted to really quickly talk about, this is really sweet, Wisdom from a Humble Jellyfish. So self-care rituals from nature. Sally, I'm looking at you here. I'll send this, don't worry. I'll like send the name. And then Sustaining Spirit. So Self-Care for Social Justice Activists by Naomi Ortiz. This is really cool because it speaks to a lot of identities, disability justice, environmental justice, spiritual practices. Amazing. And we hope to have her in winter 2020, or winter, I suppose December 2020 or January 2021. And then this is the current one I'm reading right now, which is My Grandmother's Hands, which is just amazing about mind-body practices. I will send those names on. And I'm just so grateful for Delicia, all of you and Delicia, to reconnect in this way. Do you have any resources you want to share, Delicia, before we part?
Yes, I'm not sure. They all have websites too, and I'll send them to Justine. The NAP ministry is really good. They talk about NAP as resistance and rest as resistance, and listening to your body in that way. And then Dr. Rocio Mesa, she talks a lot about decolonizing and deprogramming, and her work is related to rest as resistance as well. So those are the educators that I lean on to learn and grow and be in community with. And when I do my spiritual practice with journaling, like I said, I use Brave Enough by Cheryl Strayed, but you can use any poem book, or Rupi Kaur is also another good one. And I just flip and I pick a quote. So for us today, page 35, no is golden. No is the power the good witch wields. Take that as you wish. So in my practice, I would write that down, and whatever resonates, whatever comes up. For me, in this moment would be no is golden, right? No is a complete sentence. No is a boundary. So I think that's something to reflect on and journal on for me today. So that's what I leave you with.
Delicia, we might have to have a program on no is a complete sentence someday.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Delicia. Thank you so much, everyone. I enjoyed our time together. Again, small but mighty. That is Kirkridge, and that is this community. So thank you all, and have a wonderful day.
You as well. Thanks so much. Always